On June 15, 2017, a peculiar advertisement appeared on the darknet marketplace known as Berlusconi Market, nestled among the usual offerings of illicit substances and stolen data. The listing was different from the typical fare of criminal marketplaces. It featured glossy photographs of pristine beaches, luxury hotel suites with panoramic ocean views, and first-class airline cabins. The vendor, operating under the alias RapeSec, was offering something that seemed almost too good to be true. Vacation packages at 60% off retail prices, flights to anywhere in the world at a fraction of the cost, and 5-star hotel accommodations that would normally drain a traveler's savings account. The pitch was simple, yet enticing. Provide the vendor with screenshots of your dream vacation from Expedia, and they would create a custom listing through the marketplace to make it happen. This wasn't charity, nor was it a legitimate discount travel service that had somehow found its way into the criminal underworld. It was the birth announcement of what would become one of the most sophisticated and brazen fraud schemes to emerge from the dark web, the underground travel agency. These weren't traditional hackers seeking to drain bank accounts or steal identities for resale. These were cybercriminals who had evolved into full-service travel agents, complete with customer service departments, satisfaction guarantees, and business models that mirrored legitimate online booking platforms. The only difference was that every transaction was built on a foundation of stolen credentials, compromised airline loyalty accounts, and fraudulent credit card data obtained through phishing campaigns, data breaches, and malware infections that had plagued millions of unsuspecting victims across the globe. The emergence of RapeSec's service on Berlusconi Market represented more than just another criminal enterprise. It was a signal that cybercrime had matured beyond simple theft into a complex ecosystem of specialized services. The criminal underworld was no longer content with merely stealing credit card information and selling it to the highest bidder. Now, threat actors were providing end-to-end services, taking on the role of intermediaries who would handle every aspect of booking travel, from finding the best flights to ensuring hotel confirmations arrived in the customer's inbox. The victim of the crime, the person whose credit card was used or whose airline miles were stolen, would often remain unaware of the fraud until they checked their statement or tried to redeem their own reward points, only to discover they had been depleted by unknown transactions halfway around the world. In those early days of 2017, the dark web travel agency scene was still relatively small, operating primarily on established darknet marketplaces like Dream Market and Berlusconi. The services were rudimentary compared to what would come later, requiring significant manual effort from both vendors and customers. Buyers had to provide detailed screenshots and specifications of their desired travel arrangements, and vendors would manually process these requests, likely testing multiple stolen credit cards until one successfully processed the transaction. The process could take hours or even days, and there was always the risk that the booking would be flagged as fraudulent before the traveler could actually board their flight or check into their hotel room. But even in these early stages, the fundamental elements that would define the industry were already present. The vendors operated with a level of professionalism that was unusual in criminal circles. They maintained regular communication with customers, provided updates on booking status, and even offered rebooking services if something went wrong. Customer satisfaction was paramount, not out of any ethical consideration, but because reputation was everything in the dark web marketplace economy. A vendor with positive reviews and a track record of successful bookings could command higher prices and attract more customers. Those who failed to deliver or who scammed their own customers found themselves quickly ousted from the platforms, their accounts banned, and their reputations destroyed. The technology enabling these early dark web travel agencies was drawn from existing cybercriminal infrastructure. Stolen credit card data was already widely available on carding forums and darknet marketplaces, traded in bulk databases known as dumps that contained thousands of compromised accounts. Phishing kits had become increasingly sophisticated, capable of creating perfect replicas of airline and hotel booking websites that would trick victims into entering their login credentials. Credential-stealing malware, like information stealers and keyloggers, had infected millions of computers worldwide, silently harvesting usernames, passwords, and authentication tokens that would later be sold on underground forums or used directly by the criminals themselves. What made the travel agency model unique was the way it aggregated all these criminal resources into a single, customer-facing service. Instead of requiring customers to purchase their own stolen credit cards, learn the technical skills necessary to avoid fraud detection, and navigate the complexities of booking systems, the dark web travel agents handled everything. They were the criminal equivalent of a concierge service, taking care of every detail while insulating their customers from the technical and legal risks of the actual fraud. For many buyers, this created a psychological distance from the crime itself. They weren't stealing credit card numbers or hacking into airline systems. They were simply buying a discounted vacation from someone on the internet. The moral ambiguity was intentional, designed to attract customers who might be uncomfortable with more direct forms of theft, but were willing to look the other way if it meant saving thousands of dollars on their dream vacation. By the late summer of 2017, other vendors had begun to take notice of RapeSec's success. The potential profit margins were enormous. A first-class ticket from New York to Dubai could retail for $10,000, but if booked with a stolen credit card, the vendor's only cost was the risk of detection and the small fee charged by the darknet marketplace. Even selling such tickets at 60% off retail price meant $4,000 in revenue per transaction, with minimal overhead costs. Hotels were even more profitable, as luxury resorts often had relaxed verification procedures, especially for guests who had already paid full online. A week at a 5-star resort in the Maldives, normally costing $15,000, could be booked fraudulently and resold for $6,000, generating massive profits for the vendor while still offering customers savings they couldn't find anywhere else. The victims of these early dark web travel bookings were primarily individuals whose credit card information had been compromised in data breaches or through phishing attacks. They would typically discover the fraud days or weeks after the booking had been made, when they reviewed their credit card statements and found charges for airline tickets or hotel reservations they never made. In most cases, they could dispute the charges with their credit card companies and have the money refunded, but the process was time-consuming and stressful. More troubling were the cases involving stolen airline loyalty accounts. Frequent flyers who had spent years accumulating miles and points would log into their accounts to book a flight, only to discover that their balances had been zeroed out by unauthorized transactions. Unlike credit card fraud, airline miles were often not protected with the same level of security or fraud reimbursement. Many airlines had policies stating that once miles were redeemed, they could not be restored, even in cases of obvious theft. This left victims devastated, having lost what amounted to thousands of dollars in travel value with no recourse for recovery. The early dark web travel agencies operated in a legal gray area that was difficult for law enforcement to navigate. The vendors themselves rarely traveled on the tickets they booked, meaning they had no physical presence at airports or hotels where they could be easily identified and apprehended. The customers who did travel were often unaware that their tickets were fraudulent, believing they had simply found a good deal online. Even if customs officials or hotel staff suspected something was amiss, proving that a traveler had knowingly used stolen credentials was nearly impossible without extensive investigation. The transactions were conducted in cryptocurrency, making them difficult to trace, and the vendors used VPNs and encryption to mask their identities and locations. Law enforcement agencies were still learning how to investigate darknet crimes, and the travel agency scam presented unique challenges that didn't fit neatly into existing categories of cybercrime. As autumn arrived in 2017, the dark web travel agency model was poised for explosive growth. The early pioneers like RapeSec had proven that the concept was viable, profitable, and relatively low risk compared to other forms of cybercrime. The infrastructure was in place, the customer base was growing, and the techniques for avoiding detection were becoming more refined with each successful booking. But the real transformation was still to come, driven by threat actors who would take the model and scale it to industrial proportions, building services that rivaled legitimate travel agencies in sophistication, customer service, and global reach. The rise of the travel fraud empire. On January 8, 2018, a new player entered the dark web travel scene with an announcement that would reshape the entire underground industry. posting simultaneously on 3 major Russian-language cybercriminal forums, XSS, Exploit, and Verified. A vendor operating under the name Patriarch, or the Patriarch, unveiled what they called a premium vacation booking service. The announcement was accompanied by a professionally designed banner featuring the Patriarch logo, a stylized image suggesting luxury and exclusivity. The service promised discounts of 45 to 50% on bookings from popular legitimate sites like Booking.com, with a level of customer support that would be impressive even for a legitimate travel agency. 24 hours of dedicated assistance via Telegram, guaranteed bookings, and a satisfaction guarantee that promised rebooking at no additional charge if anything went wrong. What distinguished Patriarch from earlier dark web travel vendors was the scale of ambition and the execution of a comprehensive business model. This wasn't a side operation run by an individual karting enthusiast. Patriarch operated as a full-fledged organization with multiple team members, standardized procedures, and a marketing strategy that would make traditional businesses envious. Within weeks of the initial announcement, Patriarch's forum threads were filled with testimonials from satisfied customers, each accompanied by photographs that served as proof of successful bookings. These weren't simple screenshots of confirmation emails. Customers posted images of themselves lounging by infinity pools at 5-star resorts, sitting in business-class airline seats with champagne glasses in hand, and enjoying spa treatments at luxury hotels. Each photograph included a handwritten note thanking Patriarch for the wonderful service, often written on hotel-branded stationery, positioned to show both the message and the luxurious surroundings. The psychological impact of these testimonials cannot be overstated. In the world of darknet marketplaces, where scams and exit frauds were common, trust was the most valuable currency. Patriarch's carefully curated collection of customer photographs created a narrative of reliability and success that was difficult for potential customers to ignore. Here was proof, seemingly irrefutable, that the service actually worked. Real people were taking real vacations, staying in real hotels, and flying on real airplanes, all thanks to Patriarch's services. The fact that these bookings were facilitated through stolen credentials and fraudulent credit cards was conveniently obscured by the veneer of professional service and satisfied customers. During the early months of 2018, Patriarch's reputation grew exponentially. The vendor maintained an active presence on forums, responding to questions within hours, addressing concerns about specific booking requirements, and even offering advice on travel destinations and timing. The customer service was genuinely impressive, with team members available around the clock to handle inquiries, process booking requests, and troubleshoot any issues that arose. For customers accustomed to dealing with the often poor or non-existent customer service in other areas of the darknet economy, this level of attention was revelatory. It created loyalty among clients, many of whom returned for multiple bookings and recommended the service to others in the criminal community. The technical sophistication behind Patriarch's operation was considerable. The service relied on a steady supply of compromised credentials, which came from multiple sources. Phishing campaigns targeting airline and hotel customers provided fresh login credentials on a daily basis. Information-stealing malware deployed through malicious email attachments and infected websites harvested passwords and authentication cookies from thousands of victims. Large-scale data breaches at major corporations provided dumps of millions of customer records, complete with names, addresses, credit card numbers, and frequent flyer account information. Patriarch's team either purchased this stolen data from other cybercriminals or conducted their own credential harvesting operations, maintaining a constant supply of fresh accounts that could be used before fraud detection systems flagged them as compromised. The booking process employed by Patriarch and similar services involves sophisticated fraud techniques designed to avoid detection by airlines, hotels, and payment processors. Stolen credit cards were tested using small authorization charges before being used for large travel bookings, ensuring the cards were still active and had sufficient credit limits. Purchases were made using VPNs and proxy servers that matched the geographic location of the stolen credit card, making the transactions appear legitimate to fraud detection algorithms. Browser fingerprinting was avoided by clearing cookies, changing user agent strings, and using anti-detection software that made each booking session appear to come from a unique computer. Email addresses used for booking confirmations were carefully crafted to include the cardholder's name, adding another layer of apparent legitimacy to the fraudulent transactions. By March 2018, Patriarch had competition. A vendor named Sergey00 emerged on the same Russian-language forums, offering services that closely mirrored Patriar's model, but with some notable expansions. Sergey00's offerings included not just flights and hotel bookings, but also car rentals, guided excursions, and even complete wedding packages at exotic destinations. The vendor claimed to have provided services to famous bloggers and television personalities, though these claims were never independently verified. Like Patriar, Sergey00 maintained a strong presence on forums, cultivating relationships with customers and building a reputation for reliability. The vendor's threads were similarly decorated with customer testimonials, photographs from luxury destinations, and handwritten thank you notes that all followed the same formula: proof of location, proof of luxury, and proof of satisfaction. The parallel rise of Patriar and Sergey00 marked a turning point in the dark web travel industry. What had begun as isolated experiments by individual vendors had evolved into a competitive marketplace with established players, standardized practices, and a growing customer base that stretched across multiple countries and language groups. The services were no longer limited to Russian-speaking criminals. English-language forums like Dread and the gated community Raid forums began hosting their own travel agency discussions, with users sharing tips, techniques, and recommendations for booking fraudulent travel. The scale of the fraud was becoming substantial. In early 2018, the aviation and hospitality industries were processing billions of dollars in online bookings annually, and a growing percentage of these transactions were compromised. While exact figures were difficult to determine, companies were often reluctant to publicize the extent of fraud affecting their systems. Cybersecurity researchers began noticing patterns that suggested dark web travel agencies were responsible for a significant and rising share of fraudulent bookings. Legitimate customers would arrive at hotels to find their reservations had been canceled due to payment fraud. Airlines would discover that thousands of loyalty program accounts had been drained of miles in coordinated attacks. Credit card companies were seeing spikes in disputed charges related to travel bookings, with cardholders claiming they never authorized the purchases. On May 22, 2018, a significant development occurred that would accelerate the growth of dark web travel agencies. Empire Market, which had rapidly become one of the most popular successors to the recently seized Alphabet marketplace, began hosting a dedicated section for airline accounts, gift cards, and travel services. This dedicated category gave travel fraud vendors higher visibility and made it easier for potential customers to find these services. Within this section, dozens of listings appeared offering airline-specific accounts for carriers including Southwest Airlines, Delta Airlines, American Airlines, United Airlines, and major European carriers like Lufthansa and British Airways. The pricing structure for these airline accounts revealed the economic logic driving the fraud. According to research conducted by cybersecurity firms monitoring these marketplaces, the average base price for an airline account with minimal or no reward points was approximately $17. However, the real value came from accounts with accumulated mileage. Vendors offered customization options where customers could purchase accounts with specific point balances, with prices scaling according to the number of miles available. An account with 1 to 25,000 miles cost an additional $30 on average. Accounts with 25,000 to 50,000 miles commanded $77 in additional fees. For accounts with 50,000 to 100,000 miles, customers paid an extra $102. Premium accounts with over 100,000 miles could cost an additional $166, bringing the total price to around $183 for what might represent $5,000 or more in travel value. The mathematics of this fraud were staggering. A threat actor who managed to compromise just 100 airline loyalty accounts through a phishing campaign could generate thousands of dollars in revenue by selling those accounts on dark web marketplaces. If the same actor chose to operate as a travel agency, using those accounts to book flights for customers, the profit margins were even higher. A single frequent flyer account with 100,000 miles could be used to book multiple domestic flights or 1 or 2 international trips. By selling these bookings at 50% off retail prices, vendors could generate significant income while still offering deals that customers found irresistible. The victim experience during this period began to take on a disturbing pattern. Susan Anderson, a frequent business traveler from the United States, discovered in August 2018 that 165,000 points had been stolen from her loyalty program account approximately 3 months earlier. She only discovered the theft when she attempted to book a flight using her accumulated points, which she had been saving for over 2 years for a special family vacation. The points, equivalent to more than $1,500 in travel value, were gone. The airline initially refused to restore them, citing their policy that customers were responsible for securing their own accounts. Only after months of appeals and media attention did the airline agree to reinstate her stolen miles. But by that point, her planned vacation dates had passed, and she had been forced to purchase tickets at full price. Stories like Anderson's were becoming increasingly common throughout 2018 and into 2019. The frequency of loyalty program theft was rising sharply, driven by the proliferation of dark web travel agencies and the growing sophistication of credential theft operations. Phishing emails purporting to be from airlines would inform customers of urgent account issues, special promotional offers, or expiring miles that needed immediate attention. The emails included links to fake websites that perfectly replicated the legitimate airline portals, complete with proper branding, security certificates, and professional design. Victims who entered their login credentials would unknowingly hand over access to their accounts, which would be compromised within hours. The thieves would immediately change the account passwords, update the contact information, and begin redeeming miles for flights, gift cards, or other rewards that could be quickly converted to cash or used for fraudulent bookings. By September 2018, the dark web travel agency ecosystem had expanded to include specialized sub-services that supported the main booking operations. Vendors began offering carding methods, specifically tailored for travel websites, complete with detailed tutorials on how to avoid fraud detection when booking with stolen credit cards. These methods were often shared on forums like Raid Forums and Dread, where users would discuss which travel booking platforms had the weakest security measures and were therefore the easiest to exploit. Expedia, Booking.com, Orbitz, and Priceline were frequent topics of discussion, with threat actors sharing their experiences about which sites were cardable, meaning they could successfully process fraudulent transactions without immediately flagging them as suspicious. Third-party booking platforms became particularly attractive targets for dark web travel agencies. These aggregator sites, which compared prices across multiple airlines and hotels, were perceived by criminals as having weaker fraud prevention measures than booking directly with carriers or properties. There was some truth to this perception. Many third-party platforms prioritize conversion rates and user experience over security, implementing minimal verification procedures to avoid creating friction in the booking process. This made them ideal channels for fraudulent bookings. Moreover, these platforms had a financial structure that worked in the criminals' favor. They typically paid airlines and hotels immediately upon booking confirmation, even though the customer's credit card wouldn't be charged until later. This meant that by the time a stolen credit card was identified and the charge was disputed, the airline had already been paid and the traveler might already be in the air. The ideological justifications offered by some dark web travel vendors during this period revealed interesting psychological dynamics. On forums like Dread, threat actors would sometimes frame their activities as a form of vigilante justice against predatory travel companies. One particularly active user wrote in October 2018, "Basically, I'm taking advantage of predatory third-party travel sites. They screw over consumers, and I screw them back." This rationalization, however self-serving, found resonance with some members of the criminal community who viewed themselves as rebels fighting against corporate greed rather than common thieves. The reality, of course, was that the primary victims were not large corporations, but ordinary individuals whose credit cards and loyalty accounts were being stolen, along with the travelers who unknowingly booked fraudulent trips and faced potential legal consequences. As 2018 drew to a close, the dark web travel agency industry had firmly established itself as a permanent fixture of the cybercriminal economy. The services had evolved from crude experiments into polished operations with professional customer service, sophisticated fraud techniques, and business models that generated substantial profits. Patriarch, Sergic, 00, RapeSec, and dozens of other vendors were processing thousands of bookings per year, facilitating travel worth millions of dollars, all built on a foundation of stolen credentials and compromised accounts. The victims, credit card holders, loyalty program members, airlines, hotels, and legitimate travelers, were bearing the costs of this fraud through higher fees, stricter security measures, and the personal distress of having their accounts compromised and their travel plans disrupted. But the industry was about to face its first major reckoning. Law enforcement agencies around the world were beginning to take notice of the scale and sophistication of dark web travel fraud. The techniques that had allowed these services to operate with relative impunity were becoming understood, tracked, and, in some cases, infiltrated. The infrastructure that supported the dark web marketplaces, the forums where services were advertised, the encryption that protected communications, the cryptocurrency transactions that funded operations, was all leaving digital footprints that investigators were learning to follow. The global response in early investigations. On December 20th, 2018, Italian law enforcement made headlines with an announcement that sent ripples through the dark web community. The Guardia di Finanza, Italy's financial crime investigation unit, revealed that they had arrested 3 administrators of Berlusconi Market, one of the major dark web marketplaces where travel fraud services had flourished since 2017. The operation, conducted in coordination with Europol and law enforcement agencies from multiple European countries, represented one of the first successful takedowns targeting the infrastructure that enabled dark web travel agencies to operate. The press release from the Guardia di Finanza detailed how investigators had spent months infiltrating the marketplace, tracking cryptocurrency transactions, and identifying the real-world identities behind supposedly anonymous vendor accounts. While the announcement focused primarily on the drug trafficking that had been Berlusconi Market's primary business, investigators noted that the marketplace had also hosted significant volumes of fraud-related services, including the sale of stolen credentials, compromised airline accounts, and fraudulent travel booking services. The arrest of the marketplace administrators didn't directly target the travel agency vendors themselves, but it disrupted one of the key platforms where these services were advertised and where customers connected with vendors. The closure of Berlusconi Market had an immediate but temporary impact on the dark web travel industry. Vendors like RapeSec, who had relied heavily on the marketplace for customer acquisition, were forced to migrate to other platforms. Within weeks, many of these vendors had re-established themselves on Empire Market, Dread Forum, and various encrypted Telegram channels. The resilience of the dark web travel agencies in the face of marketplace seizures demonstrated a fundamental truth about this form of cybercrime. The business model was platform agnostic. As long as there were channels for connecting buyers with vendors, the fraud could continue. Telegram, in particular, emerged as the preferred communication platform, offering end-to-end encryption, the ability to create public channels for advertising, and private messaging for conducting transactions. During the first quarter of 2019, cybersecurity firms began publishing research specifically focused on dark web travel fraud. These reports, based on months of monitoring underground forums and marketplaces, provided the first comprehensive look at the scale of the problem. According to data compiled by cybersecurity researchers, the dark web travel agency industry was facilitating thousands of fraudulent bookings per month, with estimated values running into the tens of millions of dollars annually. The reports identified the primary techniques being used: credential phishing, targeting airline and hotel loyalty programs, the use of stolen credit cards to make bookings through third-party aggregator sites, the exploitation of last-minute booking windows to reduce the time available for fraud detection, and the manipulation of digital identities to make fraudulent transactions appear legitimate. Airlines and hotels were beginning to respond with enhanced security measures, though implementation was uneven across the industry. Some carriers introduced mandatory multi-factor authentication for loyalty program accounts, requiring users to verify their identity through SMS codes or authenticator apps before accessing their miles. Hotels upgraded their verification procedures for reservations, particularly for high-value bookings or those made with recently created accounts. Payment processors implemented more sophisticated fraud detection algorithms that analyzed booking patterns, cross-referenced traveler information with cardholder data, and flagged transactions that exhibited characteristics common to dark web travel bookings. These security improvements created new challenges for dark web travel vendors who were forced to adapt their techniques. The implementation of multi-factor authentication on airline loyalty accounts made it more difficult to use stolen credentials, though determined criminals found workarounds. SIM swapping attacks, where threat actors convinced mobile phone companies to transfer a victim's phone number to a device controlled by the criminal, allowed attackers to intercept SMS-based authentication codes. More sophisticated phishing campaigns incorporated fake, multi-factor authentication prompts, tricking victims into providing not just their passwords, but also the temporary codes needed to access their accounts. As fast as security measures were implemented, criminals developed countermeasures, continuing the endless cat-and-mouse game between fraud prevention and criminal innovation. On April 12, 2019, the first arrest directly linked to dark web travel agency fraud occurred, though it received little media attention at the time. A 26-year-old man from London was apprehended at Heathrow Airport after attempting to board a flight to Dubai that had been booked using stolen airline miles. The individual, whose name was not immediately released to the press due to ongoing investigations, had purchased the ticket through a dark web vendor for approximately 30% of its retail value. British authorities had been monitoring the vendor's activities for several months and had identified multiple bookings that were likely fraudulent. When the traveler attempted to check in for the flight, airline security noticed discrepancies between the passport presented and the account used to book the ticket. Further investigation revealed that the frequent flyer account used for the booking belonged to a business traveler in Manchester whose credentials had been stolen in a phishing attack 3 months earlier. The arrest marked an important shift in law enforcement strategy. Rather than focusing solely on the vendors operating the travel agencies, authorities were beginning to target the customers who knowingly purchased fraudulent bookings. This approach had several advantages from an investigative perspective. Customers who use these services could potentially be identified at airports and hotels, providing law enforcement with real-world opportunities for apprehension and interrogation. Once arrested, customers might be willing to cooperate with investigators, providing information about the vendors they had dealt with, the platforms where transactions occurred, and the payment methods used. Even customers who were not prosecuted could face significant consequences, including flight cancellations, denied hotel check-ins, and placement on airline watch lists that would make future travel difficult. The arrest at Heathrow, however, did not result in any public prosecution or trial. Details about the case remain scarce, likely because the individual cooperated with investigators and provided valuable intelligence about the dark web vendor network. What is known is that British authorities used the information gathered to trace cryptocurrency transactions, identify communication patterns, and build a broader understanding of how the dark web travel agency ecosystem functioned. This intelligence would prove valuable in later operations targeting the vendors themselves. By summer 2019, the dark web travel industry was thriving despite the increased law enforcement attention. Patriar and Sergej00 continued to dominate the Russian-language forums, their threads constantly updated with new customer testimonials and vacation photographs. English-language services had proliferated on Empire Market and various Telegram channels, offering bookings for customers across North America, Europe, and Australia. The vendors had adapted to the changing security landscape, developing new techniques for avoiding detection and maintaining a steady supply of compromised credentials through ongoing phishing campaigns and malware infections. The gift card aspect of the fraud was also evolving during this period. Dark web vendors had discovered that airline gift cards and travel vouchers were even easier to monetize than loyalty program miles. Gift cards could be purchased using stolen credit cards, then resold at steep discounts before the fraud was detected. Because gift cards were bearer instruments, whoever possessed the card number and PIN could use them. They were more difficult to trace than loyalty miles, which were tied to specific accounts. Vendors on Empire Market and other platforms regularly offered Southwest, Delta, United, and American Airlines gift cards at 30 to 50% discounts, claiming these were obtained through bulk purchasing or corporate liquidation sales. In reality, these cards were almost certainly purchased with stolen credit cards or obtained through data breaches targeting corporate travel departments. The scale of gift card fraud in the travel industry became apparent in October 2019, when a major U.S. airline privately disclosed to cybersecurity researchers that they had identified over $2 million in fraudulent gift card transactions in the previous 12 months. The airline's investigation had traced many of these transactions to dark web marketplaces where the cards were being resold. However, the airline faced a difficult dilemma. Deactivating all the suspected fraudulent gift cards would affect innocent customers who had purchased the cards from secondary sellers without knowing they were obtained through fraud. Allowing the fraud to continue, however, meant accepting millions of dollars in losses. The airline ultimately chose to implement enhanced verification procedures for high-value gift card redemptions, requiring additional identity verification for bookings over a certain threshold. As 2019 progressed, the techniques used by dark web travel agencies became increasingly sophisticated. Vendors began offering services that went beyond simple flight and hotel bookings to include complete vacation packages with every detail arranged. Surgic 00's wedding packages, for example, included ceremony bookings at exotic locations, photography services, catering arrangements, and honeymoon accommodations, all at prices 40 to 60% below what legitimate wedding planners would charge. These comprehensive packages required coordinating multiple fraudulent transactions across different vendors and platforms, demonstrating a level of organizational sophistication that was impressive even by criminal standards. The wedding package offerings revealed another troubling dimension of the fraud. Victims weren't just losing miles or having their credit cards charged for unauthorized purchases. They were potentially having their life events disrupted by criminal activity. A couple who booked their destination wedding through a dark web agency faced the possibility of arriving at their venue only to discover that the reservations had been canceled due to payment fraud, leaving dozens of guests stranded and years of planning destroyed. While there are no documented public cases of such disasters actually occurring, the potential for this type of catastrophic failure hung over every fraudulent booking like a shadow. Throughout late 2019 and into early 2020, the triangulation fraud technique became increasingly prominent in dark web travel operations. This sophisticated method involved 3 parties and multiple layers of deception, making it particularly difficult for fraud detection systems to identify and prevent. In a typical triangulation fraud scenario targeting travel bookings, the criminal would establish a fake online storefront or use a compromised legitimate seller account on an e-commerce platform offering deeply discounted travel packages or gift cards. When a legitimate customer made a purchase through this storefront, the criminal would use stolen credit card information to actually book the travel through a legitimate airline or hotel website. The legitimate customer would receive a valid booking confirmation, completely unaware that their trip had been purchased using someone else's stolen payment information. The criminal would keep the payment from the legitimate customer, essentially using them as an unwitting money laundering mechanism, while the stolen credit card holder would eventually discover the unauthorized charge and dispute it. This triangulation approach was particularly insidious because it created a buffer between the criminal and the actual fraud. The stolen credit card was used to make a booking that appeared to be for a real traveler with valid identification, making it harder for fraud detection systems to flag the transaction as suspicious. The legitimate customer who made the purchase through the fake storefront believed they had simply found a good deal online, perhaps through a discount travel website or a promotional offer. Only when their travel was disrupted, perhaps due to the booking being canceled when the credit card fraud was discovered, would they realize something was wrong. By that point, the criminal had already collected payment and disappeared, often having moved on to establish new fake storefronts or compromised seller accounts. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began disrupting global travel in early 2020, had a profound but temporary impact on dark web travel agencies. As airlines grounded flights, hotels closed their doors, and international borders shut down, the market for fraudulent travel bookings essentially evaporated overnight. Forum posts from Patriar and Sergic, 00 in March and April 2020, acknowledged the crisis, with vendors announcing temporary suspensions of services or pivoting to offer refund assistance for customers who had booked travel before the pandemic. Some vendors offered to help customers navigate the complex refund processes with airlines and hotels, ironically providing a form of customer service even as legitimate travel companies struggled to handle the unprecedented volume of cancellation requests. However, the pandemic also created new opportunities for travel-related fraud. As airlines and hotels became desperate to generate revenue, they launched aggressive promotions offering bonus loyalty points, deeply discounted bookings for future travel, and flexible cancellation policies. Dark web vendors adapted quickly, using stolen credit cards to purchase these promotional bookings, which could then be held as vouchers for future travel or resold to customers planning trips for 2021 and beyond. The flexible cancellation policies made this particularly low risk for criminals, as bookings could be canceled without penalty if fraud was detected before the travel date. Some vendors even specialized in purchasing travel vouchers and credits during the pandemic, building up inventories that would be used once international travel resumed. The pandemic period also saw increased law enforcement activity against cybercrime infrastructure, as many agencies found themselves with more time to focus on long-term investigations while routine street crime decreased during lockdowns. In November 2020, Interpol coordinated a global operation targeting online fraud networks that included components focused on travel-related scams. The operation, which involved law enforcement agencies from 45 countries, resulted in over 100 arrests and the seizure of millions of dollars in cryptocurrency and fraudulent assets. While the operation primarily focused on COVID-19 related scams like fake personal protective equipment sales and vaccine fraud, investigators also targeted travel fraud networks that had been operating on dark web platforms. On February 15, 2021, as global vaccination campaigns began to accelerate and travel started to show signs of recovery, the dark web travel agencies roared back to life with renewed vigor. Patreon announced their return with a dramatic forum post declaring, "We're back," accompanied by photographs from newly completed bookings and testimonials from customers who had successfully traveled during the pandemic lull. The post included specific details about new security measures the service had implemented to avoid detection, including enhanced VPN usage, more sophisticated fake identity creation, and partnerships with new credential suppliers who had access to fresh batches of stolen airline accounts. The post attracted hundreds of views within hours and dozens of comments from both previous customers welcoming the return and new users inquiring about services. Cybercriminals followed with a similar announcement days later, noting that their service had completed several test bookings successfully and was ready to resume full operations. The vendor's post emphasized that they had spent the pandemic period upgrading their infrastructure, developing new booking techniques, and establishing relationships with additional payment card suppliers. This last point was particularly significant. The pandemic had driven massive increases in online shopping and digital payments, which had in turn led to surges in payment card data breaches. Cybercriminals had harvested millions of new credit card numbers during 2020, and these fresh credentials were now being funneled into dark web travel booking operations. The return of international travel in 2021 coincided with a surge in pent-up demand from travelers who had been confined for over a year. Airlines and hotels reported booking volumes that exceeded pre-pandemic levels, and this surge created ideal conditions for dark web travel fraud to flourish. Fraud detection systems, which had been optimized for normal travel patterns, struggled to distinguish between legitimate bookings from enthusiastic travelers and fraudulent bookings from dark web agencies. The chaos of the travel industry's restart, with constantly changing entry requirements, testing protocols, and cancellation policies, provided additional cover for fraudulent activity. During the summer of 2021, cybersecurity firms began noticing a troubling new pattern in travel fraud. Criminals were increasingly targeting corporate travel accounts, which offered several advantages over individual frequent flyer programs. Corporate accounts typically had higher credit limits, less frequent monitoring by individual employees, and booking privileges that allowed for expensive business class and first class tickets without triggering the same fraud alerts that would flag such purchases on personal accounts. Phishing campaigns began specifically targeting corporate travel managers and administrative assistants who had access to company travel booking systems. These campaigns used sophisticated social engineering, often referencing real business trips or company events, to make the phishing emails appear legitimate. One particularly sophisticated attack, observed in August 2021, involved a phishing campaign that targeted employees of a Fortune 500 technology company. The emails appeared to come from the company's travel department and referenced an upcoming industry conference that many employees were planning to attend. The emails contained links to a fake travel booking portal where employees were asked to verify their corporate travel account credentials to ensure smooth processing of conference travel arrangements. The fake portal was a pixel-perfect replica of the legitimate company booking system, complete with accurate branding, employee directories, and even real conference details scraped from public sources. Over 50 employees entered their credentials into the fake portal before the company's security team identified the phishing campaign and shut it down. By that point, criminals had already used the stolen credentials to book numerous flights and hotel reservations, generating losses estimated at over $300,000. The corporate travel fraud highlighted a broader shift in dark web travel agency targeting strategies. While individual frequent flyer accounts remained valuable targets, criminals increasingly recognized that corporate travel systems represented a more lucrative and less protected frontier. Many companies had invested heavily in protecting their financial systems and customer data, but had neglected to apply the same security standards to their travel booking platforms. Travel was often viewed as an ancillary business function rather than a critical security concern, leaving vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminals were eager to exploit. By September 2021, the CETA organization, a multinational information technology company specializing in air transport communications and information technology, released their annual cybersecurity report for the aviation industry. The report revealed alarming statistics about the state of cybersecurity in travel and hospitality. According to the data, 66% of airlines and 73% of airports now identified cybersecurity as their top investment priority, a dramatic increase from previous years. The report attributed this shift to the rising sophistication and frequency of cyber attacks targeting the aviation sector, including the proliferation of dark web travel agencies that were directly impacting airline revenues and customer trust. The CETA report detailed how airlines were responding with massive investments in new security infrastructure. Biometric identification systems were being deployed at major airports to verify passenger identities more reliably. Advanced threat detection systems were being integrated into booking platforms to identify suspicious patterns in real time. Secure APIs were being developed to reduce the vulnerability of connections between airlines, travel agencies, and payment processors. Multi-factor authentication was being mandated for frequent flyer accounts, despite concerns that added security friction might frustrate customers and reduce program engagement. These investments represented billions of dollars in collective spending across the industry, all aimed at countering the threat posed by dark web travel fraud and related cybercrimes. However, the cybersecurity improvements were not implemented uniformly across the industry. Large international carriers with substantial resources moved quickly to deploy new security measures, while smaller regional airlines and budget carriers often lacked the financial resources to make similar investments. This created a tiered security landscape where criminals simply shifted their focus to the weaker targets. Dark web forum discussions in late 2021 increasingly focused on identifying which airlines and hotel chains had the weakest fraud detection systems, with vendors sharing intelligence about successful booking patterns and warning each other about carriers that had implemented effective countermeasures.